James II was a king that had a deep fascination, an obsession almost, with cannons and heavy artillery. He was actually killed by one of his own cannons. He was like every single gun-owning American who has ever existed in that respect. And James II, he was known as James of the Fiery Face on account of a birthmark that he had that covered the left side of his face. But it was also a very apt nickname because James, he had a fiery temper and a fierce pride. It's a bit like how we could quite conceivably refer to Boris Johnson as Boris, the floppy, waxy, two-faced prick, you know, not just because Boris Johnson does have quite a kind of floppy, waxy face, but also because, you know, he's a fucking two-faced prick as well, you know. Now, James II, he ascended to the throne at the tender age of only 6 years old, and so a regent was required to rule in the king's name. But the problem was that James I had completely decimated the Scottish nobility. There was no obvious candidate to step into this role. And so into this power vacuum stepped two men, two ruffians, two opportunists. One was Alexander Livingston, because, you know, Livingston is where a lot of Scotland's ruffians and opportunists come from, and Sir William Crichton. Now, Crichton, he was the keeper of Edinburgh Castle, and Sir Alexander Livingston, he was the keeper of Stirling Castle. And it was to Edinburgh Castle where the Queen, Joan Beaufort, had escaped with the infant James II after the murder of James I. But Joan, she quickly found herself a prisoner of William Crichton, and so she escaped Edinburgh Castle and made her way to Stirling Castle, expecting better treatment from Alexander Livingston, who instead did the exact same thing and had Joan and James locked up in Stirling Castle, claiming that he was acting out of great truth and loyalty, which, as far as defences for kidnappings go, is about as useless as possession is 9/10 of the law, or some shite about not being able to sweat or something like that. And while James II was out riding near Stirling Castle and Joan was presumably at a nearby tapas restaurant with her pals, William Crichton then snatched the young king again and took him back to Edinburgh Castle. And so James II, he was going between Edinburgh and Stirling Castles like neighbours swapping cups of sugar. And the whole point was, in order to rule through the king, you needed possession of the king, which is why both Livingston and Crichton were so keen to get a hold of James and lock him up. It's why they were both acting like Britney Spears' dad, basically. Now, while all this was going on, the young, dashing 15-year-old William Douglas's minority was coming to an end. Now, basically, what this meant was he was quickly becoming too old for Prince Andrew, but also old enough to inherit the Douglas earldom, making him the most powerful man in the country with 5,000 knights and 5,000 spearmen at his disposal. And so Livingston and Crichton, they decided to put their differences aside to deal with this potential threat from the Douglases. And they invited William Douglas and his younger brother David to dine with the young 10-year-old James II at the Great Hall in Edinburgh Castle on the 24th of November, 1440, in an infamous episode from Scottish history known as the Black Dinner. After a genial dinner, William Douglas, he was presented with the head of a black bull, a traditional sign of doom in Scotland, which is why Aberdeen Football Club have a black bull as their club mascot. And William Douglas and David Douglas, they were given a mock trial for treason before they were then taken out into the courtyard at Edinburgh Castle, where a makeshift execution block had already been erected. It's a bit like if a member of ISIS was to ever to go on Come Dine With Me. You know, that would be like their after-dinner entertainment, you know? And so a traumatised 10-year-old James II watched on as William Douglas, who he absolutely idolised, was beheaded along with his younger brother David right in front of his very eyes. Now, James II, he began his personal rule in 1449 after his marriage to the niece of the Duke of Burgundy, Marie de Gueldres. And the Duke of Burgundy, he gave to James II a wedding present, a ginormous siege cannon called Mons Meg. It was a huge, impractical cannon, which is still a pride of place in Edinburgh Castle. Or if you're American, you can probably just go down to Walmart and pick one up, you know. Mons Meg is a huge pull for tourists to Edinburgh Castle. It is by far and away the biggest weapon in Edinburgh Castle. Well, at least it was until Robbie Williams played there last summer, you know. And on beginning his personal rule, James II was eager to get revenge on both Livingston and Crichton and the powerful Douglases. The man who had inherited the Douglas earldom after the murder of William and David was their great-uncle James, who was almost certainly in the conspiracy because he did nothing to avenge the murders of William and David. And at the time of James's personal rule beginning, the Earl of Douglas was his son, Walter Douglas, who in 1450 was attending a papal jubilee in Rome, showing off his ostentatious wealth like a offshore oil worker returned home for the weekend. And while he was away embarrassing himself on the continent like a travelling Rangers supporter, James, he seized two of the Douglas castles. In retaliation, Walter Douglas, he entered into a powerful alliance with the Earls of Ross and the Earls of Crawford. And so, on the 22nd of February 1452, James II, promising Walter Douglas safe passage, he invited him to Stirling Castle to try and talk him out of this alliance with Ross and with Crawford. And when Walter Douglas refused to do so, James II, he stabbed him in the chest and then stabbed him in the neck before the rest of his courtiers piled on to destroy him like they had just discovered some un-PC tweets from 2012 from the guy. He was stabbed 26 times and his skull was caved in with a poleaxe. And after the murder of Walter Douglas at Stirling Castle, James II, he slowly but surely dismantled the Douglas power base in Scotland, taking out the Douglas allies one by one. And by 1455, he had made himself one of the most powerful and one of the most respected kings in all of Europe. And he took advantage of the civil war in England, the War of the Roses, which had just broken out, to try and get back two of the English-held castles that remained in the borders, at Berwick and at Roxburgh. And it was while he was besieging Roxburgh Castle on the 3rd of August 1460 that James II, he'd forgotten to social distance himself from the cannon that he had just lit, a huge siege cannon called the Lion. It burst its casing and a piece of shrapnel came flying out from the cannon, instantly killing James II, although he probably would have survived if he had his mask on, you know. And so James II was struck down in his prime, only 29 years old. And Scotland, it was left once again with yet another child monarch, the 9-year-old James III, who I'm going to speak to you guys about next time. Thank you very much for listening.